The last thing that the United States' neocon foreign policy establishment wanted was to strengthen Russia. They seem to have decided that Russia is the great problem in the world and that they would concentrate on weakening Russia. That's a major part, not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it. Sanctions program of stopping purchases of oil and gas by Europe from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of the cheapness, European products were lower priced. They didn't have to raise the price as much because they got the cheap energy. And that made European economy successful, competitive, able to export, which the engine of European growth has been. Germany, above all, as an exporter. All of that was undercut when the sanctions went into effect in order to weaken Russia. But they didn't work. And they didn't work for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners with whom Russia had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS wasn't an organization formed last year or the year before. It's older, and Russia had cultivated in lots of ways relationship with India, China, South Africa, Brazil. And so they bought Russian oil and gas. To make a complex story short and sweet, Russia turned out to be strengthened. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to the BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. In order for India and China to buy the oil and gas from Russia, they had to work out the economics of this enormous business imposed on them by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 Europe allies. And so the BRICS became better coordinated, more dependent one on the other, more having their economies intertwined. Bottom line, Russia and the BRICS became stronger, and the United States became less powerful because of it, more isolated because of their own decisions to have the war in Ukraine. And that isolation of the United States is now deepening because of its decision to be as supportive unilaterally to Israel as they have decided to be. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been to isolate the United States. The world has changed, and the United States is denying that to its own detriment. China is coming closer and closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States, and its alliance, now accounting for nearly half of the population of this planet, is going to overtake and surpass the United States, which is 4.5% of the population of this planet. The unique position of the United States as dominant coming out of World War II couldn't possibly have lasted forever. It was a delusion to imagine it. And all that's happening now is the foreseeable reality that the rest of the world has caught up, has figured out how to grow fast, catch up to the United States, surpass it. That was in the cards from day one, should have been planned for, wasn't, should have been understood, wasn't, should have been discussed and debated in the United States, wasn't, and I leave it to you all to understand. There is virtually no discussion of what is probably the most important economic issue facing this country, which is how do we cope with, how do we work with, how do we live with the decline of the American empire, the decline of American capitalism, the rise of other capitalist economic and other systems around the world? That's what we're going to have to figure out. That is the issue we face, and denial, dealing, for example, with this BRICS conference in Russia as if it were a Russian event, as if it were all about Mr. Putin. It wasn't. It isn't. That's the same denial. You can't see what's going on because you have to rewrite it as the old Cold War struggle of the United States versus Russia. It's not only tiresome, it leads you to make catastrophic mistakes, like the war in Iraq, like the policies in the Middle East, and indeed everything else coming down the pike, so long as one of the two superpowers pretends that it's not one of two superpowers. It's pathetic and dangerous to watch. The economic growth of the United States for this year is scheduled to be 2.8%. Let me ask everyone, keep that in your mind, 2.8% growth, and that's faster than any one of the other of the G7. Okay, now let me compare that first to Russia. Their economic growth rate, by the way, all these numbers come from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, a Western institution dominated by the G7. Russia's growth in 2024, 3.9%. Let's turn next to China, 4.8%. That's almost double the economic growth rate of the United States this year. And then we come to India, which is 7%, almost triple the level of the United States. And I wouldn't bring you these numbers for 1 year if they weren't, in fact, the kinds of numbers we have seen for decades. That's why the Chinese are where they are. They caught up. They grew faster. They figured out how to raise the standard of living of their people much faster than anyone ever did before. This is not an endorsement of the Chinese economy or society or suggesting they don't have lots of problems. They do. All countries do. But when it comes to economic growth, that's their strong suit, folks. And that's what makes the difference in the world economy, doesn't it? To pretend that this isn't going on, that this isn't suggesting where the future lies, of course they have a good humor among themselves at their conference. They are the growing, dynamic core of the world economy now. The West isn't. And that's not about to change. That's why you have to come to terms with it, rather than pretending that such situations don't exist or that it's all about Mr. Putin. It isn't. Let me remind you of another statistic. The GDP of the United States remains number one in the world, somewhere between 25 and 30 trillion dollars a year. That's the legacy of being the dominant economy for the last century. What is the GDP of Russia, our so-called enemy? 2 trillion, maybe 3. People should understand Russia has never been an economic threat to the United States. It can't be. It's too small. It may have a powerful military, but economically, not at all. The United States could, if it worked out an arrangement, easily come to terms with an economy that's so much smaller. The Chinese economy, that's a completely different thing. Their GDP is around 17, 18 trillion dollars. Catching up, exactly. And Russia and China together, and India and Brazil added, yeah, that gives you the powerhouse that I've been describing and that BRICS represents. The road forward with continued denial is a road into making mistakes. Let me remind everyone, at the beginning of the war in 2022, there were predictions from the president on down. Russia would be destroyed. Russia would fall to its knees. The ruble would collapse. Russia would become dismembered. Putin would be ejected. None of that happened. Why? Because they didn't understand BRICS, what it meant, what it could do, how it could intervene with Russia to change the outcome. More such mistakes are coming if you continue to pretend that we're all in some old Cold War 2.0 rather than in a new economic situation. look, I do understand. I'm an American citizen, born here, lived here, worked here all my life. It is very hard to be in the period of decline of an empire. I'm sure it was hard for the British who lost their empire a century ago, and it was hard for the Dutch and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, but we do have the benefit of knowing that and making at least some choices to accept it, to understand it, and to work out a live and let live with the rest of the world. Otherwise, the doom and gloom predictions of World War III and all the forms that is taking will in the end overtake us. Not because they have to happen, not because they're built into the system, but rather because a population having to face the decline of its empire, the decline of its system, wants to deny it rather than treat it in the manner that adults kind of know they ought to do. At the end of the war, the United States had had one experience with bombs falling on its territory. That was Pearl Harbor at the beginning. Never again. No damage was done here. No explosions happened. No invasion occurred. None of it. We lost some troops, but relatively much less than other countries. Meanwhile, all the potential competitors of the United States, Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, but even Britain, France, Italy, they were all defeated. Their factories were bombed, their railroads wrecked, all the rest of it. So we came out a unique position. We held that unique position for most of the rest of the 20th century, the second half of that century, when we could do pretty much what we wanted. It didn't matter. We were so dominant, the economic system here. We helped the others rebuild from the war in Japan, in Western Europe, and so on. And we could do what we wanted. They had this notion that you're kind of alone in the world, that everybody has to adjust to you. That's over. And now it won't work. I'm going to explain why these tariffs are a mistake, as if you were in the position you were before. So I will slap you with a tariff and I will not suffer consequences. This is completely wrong. I'm going to give you the example. Electric vehicles. They are the vehicles of the future. Between the damage to our health and the damage to the resource base of this planet, burning fossil fuels to move our cars and trucks is on the way out. It's going to be replaced not by the rational decision, that would be mass transportation, but by the irrational but profitable decision to substitute electric vehicles for fossil fuel burning vehicles. Given that, here's the reality. The Chinese participated, along with the Europeans and the Americans, over the last 15 years to produce a profitable electric vehicle. That competition has been won by the Chinese, above all by a particular company, BYD. And if you don't know what that company is, that's a sign of denying what's going on in the world. In this case, by the mass media, who haven't told you about it. BYD produces the highest quality, lowest price electric car and truck. Bingo, there it is. They're selling it all over the world, including Europe, by the way. But you won't find those vehicles on the roads in the United States today. Why? Because there's currently a 100% tariff. What that means is if the car costs $30,000 bringing it in from China, you and I would have to pay $60,000 to buy it. 30 to the Chinese manufacturer and 30 to Uncle Sam, because that's what the tariff is, a tax. Here's what that means, my fellow Americans. All over the world, every company that makes things that compete with American products, companies that make shirts, companies that make food, companies that make software programs, they make anything. They all have to buy cars and trucks. It's part of their business. They're going to get the best quality, cheapest electric truck, and that will be reflected in low prices for what they produce. In contrast, Americans who have to pay way more for those electric trucks with the big tariff will charge much more for their product than their foreign competitors, and they'll lose business. and you and I will lose our jobs. Why? Because of the tariff. So this may sound good. It may look like you're being a tough guy, Mr. Trump, but what you're doing is playing a silly political game that will come back and bite you and me where it hurts. After World War II, the dollar became virtually universally recognized as the global currency, basically playing the role in the world that once was played by the British pound, say in the 19th century or early part of the 20th. Central banks in virtually every country held as reserves to support their own currency gold and the dollar, leading to the very famous phrase, the dollar is as good as gold. Saudi Arabia and the oil countries adopted the program of selling oil around the world to any buyer, but only for dollars, and then parking those dollars in New York City banks or in U.S. treasuries. It became the focus, and there are enormous benefits to that. The United States, for example, was able to pay for the goods and services produced around the world, the French wine, the Japanese computer, the fill in the blank, by sending them dollars. Unlike in other countries, those dollars didn't come back to buy goods and services here. They held on to the dollar because it was useful to them to do so, which means that for 50 years, the United States was able to consume the produce of the world and gave them in exchange little green pieces of paper, our currency that cost us nothing and are worth, per se, nothing. The benefits of doing this were incalculable. You couldn't explain American economic well-being in the last 70 years without the role played by the dollar. That's all gone. Today, central banks around the world, depending on the numbers you use, hold reserves only 50% in dollar, instead of the 80 or 90% that was the norm as little as 20 years ago. So the symbolic meaning of that is enormous. The financial meaning, the real consumption, all of that. Here's a second example. We are now in a weird situation. The United States supports Israel in Gaza. Okay, it's one of the few countries in the world to do that. Out of 195 countries in the world that are members of the United Nations, and I keep track of this, 146 out of 195 have recognized Palestine as a state in the same way that they recognize Israel as a state, or the United States as a state, or France as a state. The United States and its allies are the only ones left supporting. Last week, Spain, Norway, and Ireland joined the list of countries recognizing Palestine. The United States is the only significant support Israel has. Even the other countries that don't yet recognize Palestine give it at best nominal support. Perhaps you would want to make an exception of Germany because it has that odd history of being the place that operated a genocide against Jewish people. But the truth of the matter is the decision by Mr. Biden after the invasion of Gaza by the Israelis to give them 100% support, what is he doing? That wasn't even necessary. He is so wrapped up in the way the world was that he doesn't understand that the Palestinians have won the battle against Israel around the world. Right now, you can't run a ship through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. Why? Because the Houthis, in sympathy with the Palestinians, have made that impossible. That has enormous effects on the world, on trade, on movement of shipping. And I can assure you, every Arab country, every Muslim country, and beyond, but right there I'm talking about, half the world, are trying to figure out how they can be supportive of Palestine. Turkey has stopped trading with Israel in part because of this. That's what their leader said. My heart goes out to the Israelis too, because they are in the process of miscalculating with the United States how the world has changed, and it's going to impact Israel, which doesn't have the resources to cope with that, even worse than it is already impacting here in the United States. How valuable is NATO when 3 of its members, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, last week decide to go against the heavy pressure of the United States and recognize the Palestinian state. In and of itself, it's a small step. Symbolically, it's an enormous step. It shows we don't agree with you on one of the central geopolitical conflicts in the world, and we're going to do it publicly. And the reason, by the way, it happened is because the leaders of all three countries know what Americans don't want to face, which is the overwhelming majority of people in all three of those countries are siding with the Palestinians, not the Israelis, in the issues of Gaza, so that the local politicians had to act, not out of sympathy with the Palestinians, but to save their own political skin. Inflation means that prices in general are going up. Not all of them the same rate. Some of them can go down, but the general direction of prices is up. That's all the word inflation means. Okay, step 2 in the logic. If rising prices are an inflation, the next question is, who determines the prices? Answer: employers determine prices. If you're an employee, you've never been called into a room to participate in setting prices. That's done by the boss. That's done by the corporate board of directors, the leading managers. It's a tiny group of people. In our country, the U.S. Census Department lists employers 3% of our population. The other 97% are not. There's no democracy in inflation. A tiny group of people never elected to the job, which doesn't exist. It's simply understood that if you're an employer, you set the price. You raise it, you lower it, you keep it the same, your business. Okay, so when inflation means employers made the decision. Why did they raise prices? Answer: the same reason they do everything else, to maximize their profits. That's what makes a business successful. So we can answer the question, an inflation happens if and when employers see profit in raising prices. So they do. That means that inflation is a profit-driven phenomena that hurts the rest of the people who have to pay more for what they used to get for less. And it's great for profits because that's why it's done. All right, the minute you understand that, then you understand that we live in a system whose economic arrangement is the opposite of democracy. We don't democratically decide what things are going to cost in the store. We never did. We have an autocracy. We have an authoritarian economic system that gives a tiny percentage of the people control over the prices we all pay. When they run an inflation, and when we have a mass of people complaining about it, and that's been the United States in the last 2 years, we turn to an institution set up for this called the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And if you look at the charter of the central bank, one of its jobs is to maintain price stability. So right off the bat, when we have an inflation, we know that the Federal Reserve has failed to do one of the two things it was asked to do. So what does the Federal Reserve do? In the case of the United States in the last 2 years, it raises interest rates. Now, for the mass of people, this makes a bad situation worse. In addition to rising prices of my breakfast cereal and my haircut and my computer program, I now have to pay more on my credit card because the interest rate on my balance has just gone up. So this is a solution that makes the problem worse. It's not the only solution. That the Federal Reserve, in acting in that way, shortcut what should have been the debate. How do we deal with the inflation that the employer class has imposed on us? We might have remembered that a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, confronting an inflation then, made the following decision, which he announced on TV. Any company that raises its price, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in the clink. And any union that raises your wages or tries to, we will do the same. He declared what came to be known as a wage price freeze. Did it stop the inflation? On a dime, right away, real quick. Did it raise interest rates? No, it chose an alternative policy. We live in a country which not only did not do what it did a few years ago, but acted as if there was no option. So we have lots of experience with that tool to fight inflation. But we live in a country that can't face most of its economic problems because they too function as distractions from these kinds of real issues. A few years ago, we had shortages. We couldn't get toilet paper. We couldn't get medicines of all kinds. We have shortages right now. The most popular nonsense spoken about shortages in the past was, ready? Supply chain disruptions. That's a euphemism. That's another way of saying shortages. Now, I can show you shortages across the board, all over the place, virtually every year since 1971. To assign to shortages some sort of role as evidence, at the very least, you'd have to show me that there were more shortages during a time of wage price controls than there were during all those years when there weren't price controls. Every policy designed to solve any problem turns out to have strengths and weaknesses. I'd be the last one to argue that a wage price freeze didn't have all kinds of problems, not particularly the shortages. The more powerful argument at the time, since I follow these things since that time, the biggest problem was escapism. In other words, there was an escape clause. You could apply for an exemption from the wage price freeze. So every corporation went to work, hired the most expensive lawyers imaginable and lobbyists to go to Washington to get an exemption for your firm or your industry. And that leads to all kinds of misallocation. I get all that. But interest rates have that as well. Interest rates have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of the interest rate is we've had elevated interest rates and they didn't prevent our inflation. We're still struggling with an inflation, and there are as many people now saying that prices are going to go back up as there are people saying that they're going to go down. So interest rate is not some magic bullet. It's not some guarantee, but it really hurts a lot of people and it helps others. The bigger your company, the less an interest rate increase is going to hurt you. The reason we have central banks, including the Bank of the U.S. and what later became the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the 20th century, was because when we left interest rates to the, quote, free market, we got crazy volatility that was extremely dangerous to the stability of the system. We brought in the regulators, we brought in the institution to deal with the ineffectiveness and the danger of not doing it. We're stuck. We don't work well without a central bank, and we don't work that well with one. That's a contradiction, but it is not resolved by oscillating back and forth between the two, pretending when you don't have a central bank that getting one will solve your problem makes no more sense than responding to the failures of the central bank by extolling the virtues of a free market. You can't go with either of them. The reason we see the Federal Reserve having anxious meetings over the last couple of years in which the top news item that evening is they met and they either raised the interest rate or they didn't, or they raised it by 50 basis points and not 25, et cetera, is because the mass of people are already involved. There is a small smidgen of democracy because they're making it hot for politicians not to do something.